Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. And today, I'm going to be giving you the top 3 reasons your low end sucks and what to do about it. Let's be honest, all of us, every single one of us listening to this has at one point been frustrated with the bottom end on our records. It is absolutely the hardest part to get right. And there are a few reasons for this. One of them, notably, is it can be the hardest for us to hear in our rooms and on our headphones, and I'm going to give you some workarounds for that. But there's other reasons as well. It's also one of the most impactful parts of your mix to get wrong. When your low end isn't speaking right, when it feels cluttered or muddy or weak and thin, it can end up dragging your whole mix down. Generally speaking, if your low end isn't sitting right, your whole mix isn't sitting right. So it's at once one of the hardest things to get right and one of the most important things to get right. But why are we even talking about that? You already know that. You've already experienced the frustration for yourself. I know I have, but I'm going to give you some clear ideas about what's going wrong and what you can do differently. Really comes down to these 3 major areas that are messing up all of your bottom end instruments, but fortunately, there are things that you can do. Before we get right into all of those tips, the only thing I've got to do is give the briefest of shout outs to our sponsors. This is a podcast, and podcasts are free because of sponsors. And our sponsors on this one include you. How do you sponsor the podcast? If you're on YouTube, hit like, remember to hit the subscribe button, hit the notifications bell. If you're listening on audio-only format like Spotify or Apple Podcasts, consider giving us a rating and review. It really does help spread the word. But the best way you can sponsor this podcast, as always, is by sponsoring yourself. Check out one of our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs. They'll give you a whole system for mixing that's going to help you get everything in the mix right, not just the low end. But it will also increase your confidence and creativity in mixing, making your finishing rate go way up while your time to complete each mix and your second guessing of yourself go down dramatically. That's possible once you get a real system, a real roadmap for mixing, like you're going to find in Mixing Breakthroughs. Check that out over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. It has a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you got absolutely nothing to lose. If you prefer to learn everything I know about mastering, which is why I do day in and day out these days, check that out over at masteringendemystified.com. Or if you want to finally get a handle on learning to use, understand, and hear compression like a pro, then the course Compression Breakthroughs is for you. Like all of our other courses, it does come with that 30-day money-back guarantee, so 0 risk to you. I'll tell you about our branded sponsors later, but just want to let you know about some quick free things. GPU Audio is sponsoring the podcast once again. Right now, you can get free early access to the open beta for their convolution reverb and soon a whole suite of plugins that run on the GPU inside your computer. Check them out over at gpu.audio/sonicscoop. That's gpu.audio/sonicscoop. Or if you want to try out some of my favorite mixing effects in the known universe, check out Sound Toys, where you can try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's get right into this week's podcast episode. The 3 things that are messing up your low end like nothing else. And issue number 1 when it comes to low end, or at least what you're doing with your low end, is stacking all of your low frequency instruments into the same part of the low frequency spectrum. You've got to start thinking about your low frequencies as not just being one area, but being at least 2, if not more, distinct areas, each of which can really only handle one low frequency instrument at a time. If you want your kick drum to be really dominant in the low subs, and you also want your bass to be really dominant in the low subs, you're probably going to have a pretty bad time. There are some rare exceptions and possible workarounds here, which we will get into, but in general, only one instrument can be the lowest instrument in the mix. There's not more than one lowest element you can have in your mix. It just defies logic, right? Only one thing can be the lowest. And if you try to make more than one bass element the lowest, like a kick and a bass at the same time, they're going to fight with each other. They're going to be sitting on top of each other, and they're going to be muddying each other, and you're going to be taking the power away from both of those elements. It's counterintuitive, but by trying to make them both powerful in the same part of the low frequencies, you make them both less powerful. So one of the easiest ways to think about this is having one of your elements, say a kick drum, be the one that is more dominant in the subs, and another element, say your bass, be the one that's more dominant in the upper bass. So maybe your kick drum has its lowest frequency content, most dominant in that region from, say, 40 to 60 hertz, and then the bass has most of its lowest frequency content in that range of, say, 80 hertz to 120 hertz. Or it could be the other way around. You could have a really big bottom-heavy bass line that really has a lot of sub in it, and then have a tight, knocky-sounding kick drum on top of it, and those two can stay out of each other's way. By giving each of them their own special part of the bottom end to live in, both of them are going to sound more audible, more powerful, and more impressive. Now, which one should be the lower of the two? It really depends on the arrangement, but listen to the arrangement to give you clues. What's usually going to be the case is that the more sparse of the two instruments, the one that is playing a less busy part, is likely to be the one that wants to be the lower of the two elements. Usually the one that's playing a busier pattern with more notes in it more often is usually going to want to be the higher instrument of the two. If you are recording or producing, this is something you can think about long before the mix stage. And honestly, the best decisions around this kind of thing are done at the production, arrangement, and recording stage, not at the mixing stage. But you as a mixer have some ability and some power to control these things. And it can be as simple as literally just cutting some real low subs out of one of your two bass instruments. And I know this sounds counterintuitive to you, especially if you're fairly new at mixing. You say, well, my kick and bass, they're both low frequency instruments. I can't cut lows from them. They would stop being low and big and powerful. No, it's the opposite. By cutting some of the low frequencies out of one of your two low frequency elements, you're going to make both of them more powerful and more audible. Justin, what do I do this with? Do I do it with a high pass filter, a low cut filter, totally removing low end? Do I do it with a shelving filter, taking down a little bit of low end below a certain point? Do I do it with a bell filter to just target a specific spot? And the answer to that is yes. Use your judgment, go in there and try each of those approaches. Each of them has their own effect. And each of those approaches might be needed in different contexts. But that is a good overall thing to do. And in general, the more low frequency elements you're trying to fit into the bottom end, the more heavy-handed you'll have to get with this. I remember the first time this really sunk in for me. I was on a mixing session on a track where there was a kick drum, a bass guitar, and a synth bass. And just the low end on this track was an absolute mess. And the other slightly more experienced producer, mixer in there with me, who is the owner of the studio and almost acting kind of like my assistant that day, said, Justin, why don't you try cutting off a whole lot of low end on that synth bass? And I looked at him and said, you're crazy. It's a synth bass. It's supposed to have a lot of low end. It's a synth bass. Like bass is one of the two words in the name of the instrument. It's supposed to have low end. You're asking me to cut subs out of it? And he said, you just give it a try. And I put on, in this case, fairly radical, fairly steep, low-cut filter to get rid of a lot of sub-frequency information and a lot of kind of mid-bass information as well. And then all of a sudden, the whole low end opened up. And here was the ironic thing. It felt like there was more low end in the track, even though I took away low end, because now all of a sudden you could hear what the kick was doing, you could hear what the bass was doing, because the synth bass wasn't getting in the way of the kick and the bass. And by taking away lows, we had more audible and more powerful lows that were actually doing something, lows that were actually making you move your body, tap your foot, nod your head, instead of just a big, amorphous, indistinct blob of low end where you can't make out anything that's going on whatsoever, and it ends up sounding like you have no lows in your bottom end because your bottom end is incoherent. The problem isn't that you have too little low end. It's that you have badly managed low end. So that's why I want you to think about that there's only so much real estate in the low end. Maybe it's like a multifamily house where you can fit 2, maybe 3 apartments in there, maybe 4 apartments in there. But let's say that this house, you probably can only have 2 nice-sized apartments to live in that house. Maybe if you make each one of them a little bit smaller, you can fit in 3. But I'll tell you what, you know what would be a bad idea? Knocking down the walls in all of those apartments and trying to get all 3 of those different families to live in the same big house together. That would probably be a mess. Let me know if that analogy worked for you. I just made that one up on the spot, so let me know in the comments down below if this is working for you. I didn't rehearse that one, but I think it's a good one. You want each of those families to live in a separate apartment in the house, not all of them together in the house where it's going to be like a reality TV show. That's not what we want going on our low end. We don't need Dr. Phil or Maury Povich to have to intervene over here. Am I dating myself with Maury Povich? Is he still around? I have no idea. Anyway, getting back to things that the young people will understand. Low end. Make sure there's a different space for each one of your low end elements. You can generally think about dividing the low end up into sub bass and upper bass. Or if you really need to think about it in a slightly more detailed way, you can think of it as being your sub bass, your mid bass, and your upper bass. Subs are generally anything from 20 hertz all the way up to 60 hertz, 70 hertz, 80 hertz. And your upper bass is probably stuff from 100 hertz or 120 hertz all the way up to 200 hertz. There's some crossover, and it really depends on the specific instruments in that mix, where your sub bass ends and your upper bass begins, or you might think of it as being 3 different regions with middle bass somewhere around 100 being a distinct region. But that's the first thing to get through your head to solve this problem of low end that's just all on top of each other with no room for each of them to live, breathe, or speak on their own. Now, there are other things you can do. If you absolutely need to have a kick drum with a ton of bottom end in the subs and a bass with a ton of bottom end in the subs, you can potentially do it. Here are the workarounds. 1, they can't both happen at the same time. So maybe in your chorus, your kick drum is the subdominant element, and in your verse or your bridge that happens one time, the bass is the subdominant element. And you're going to have to be okay with the section where the bass is the subdominant element, kind of overtaking the subs in your kick, and vice versa. They can both be dominant in the same area at different times. And you can think about that as being in different sections of the song. But if you're really clever and you're producing or arranging, you can make that happen within a section by having kick and bass play contrary rhythms. So this is kind of almost number 2. They can both be big in the same areas at different times from either number 1, section to section, or number 2, within a section, if they are playing contrary rhythms where they don't step on each other. There are some great hip hop productions in particular where this can happen, where you have a bass line that's really big, and just as that bass fades out, now the kick is hitting. But they're almost never both happening at exactly the same moment in time. So that's another trick there. The other thing that you potentially can do that's a little bit like this is the idea of side chaining. And you probably hear this talked about a lot, particularly in EDM circles. And this idea of side chaining does work in the macro dynamic sense, where your kick is hitting, and when your kick hits, it brings down your bass line, and maybe some other elements in your mix as well. This can be done with a sidechain compressor. Say you put a compressor on your bass, but what's triggering that compressor is not the bass itself, it's the kick drum. And whenever the kick drum hits, it sucks down the compressor on the bass. So the kick drum, when it's hitting, and only when it's hitting, does it bring down the bass. Potentially just the subs or just the low end in the bass, or potentially the entire thing. Some people will also manually draw in side chains. You could do this with automation. It's technically not a side chain, but you could draw in volume changes on other elements like a bass, or even EQ on a bass using your mouse if you want to be really particular about it. Or you can set a compressor side chain to do it. But this idea of sidechaining can also be used not only on this macrodynamic sense, but in a microdynamic sense, where two elements that hit at the same exact time, there's a sidechain happening to make your layers and your blends work better. This is a trick that's bigger for hip hop. While sidechaining down a bass with a kick drum is something that's super relevant for a lot of EDM producers, for hip hop producers, when you're layering a kick sound, often there'll be more than one component of that kick sound. There may be a kick sample, and there may be underneath it an 808 sample. And those two samples together, kick and 808, is what's giving us our kick sound on the hip hop record. But here's an issue. The attack on an 808 isn't much to speak of. They're really low and blobby and indistinct and don't give you kind of much punch or much bounce. They're often not very tight sounding or necessarily very audible in the mid-range and higher frequencies that you can hear. So when you're layering a kick and 808 together and both of those elements make a new kick sound, it can be smart for the attack of the kick to suck down the 808. Even though these two elements are happening together, what you hear is unimpeded attack of your kick drum with some extra sustain and fullness coming later from the 808. So you're keeping the 808 out of the way of the attack of the kick drum, letting the attack of the kick drum have the bottom end real estate, and then letting the sustainy 808 join that kick drum after the attack of the kick drum has passed through. This can be done again with a sidechain on a compressor, or it can be done with volume automation in your DAW. So this idea of keeping elements out of the way of each other doesn't necessarily only apply to two different instruments that are fighting with each other. It can apply to two samples that make up one instrument. Head explode. I hope that one was useful for you. It was really useful for me when I discovered it, and maybe it's something you can bring into your productions, and not only if you're in the hip hop genre. Okay, so that is the number one reason that your low end sucks, that you have multiple instruments fighting for exactly the same real estate. You haven't yet divvied up that real estate and said, oh, this area of the low end is for the bass and this area of the low end is for the kick, and let's keep them away from each other, either in frequency or in time. But number two major reason that your low end sucks, and this one is super big, is that your mid-range sucks. This is a big problem on a lot of beginning mixes from beginning mixers. They get it into their head that this is a low frequency instrument. So for it to be heard, we have to boost low frequencies on it. This makes kind of intuitive sense, right? It's a low frequency instrument, so we boost low frequencies. But the reality is that all that stuff you're boosting down below 100 hertz, down below 80 hertz, down below 60 hertz, isn't actually heard by most people on most systems. And in a lot of cases, all it's doing is eating up your headroom in the mix, making the overall mix sound more congested, more dull, less loud and exciting. And at the same time, you're not actually making your low-end instruments more audible to most people on most systems. In fact, most of these people, most of the time, who think that they should be boosting their low-frequency instruments or boosting the low frequencies on their low frequency instruments, aren't even hearing the low frequencies in their rooms themselves. They're not even aware of just how much they're boosting the bottom end on these elements. They're just like a lot of the end listeners. They're not even hearing those boosts that they're making themselves. And in most cases, you'd be better served, instead of just boosting level and just boosting low frequencies, by looking at your mid-range on your low frequency instruments and boosting that instead. Because that is what will be heard on smaller systems by most people and in your own room. The most audible, defined sounding low frequency instruments, kicks, basses, synths, whatever, sound defined and audible and apparent because they have appropriate amounts of mid-range going on. And each instrument is a little bit different. On kick drum in, say, rock music, and particularly in metal music, there might be significant boosts going on anywhere from 2K up to 6K, the upper mid-range. And that articulation, that attack on that kick drum from 2K to 6K is what's giving it its detail and impact, and what's catching the ear and letting you hear the bottom end on that kick drum. And if you didn't have that upper mid-range on the kick drum, you wouldn't even hear the low frequency that's there. But as soon as you bring out that upper mid-range, all of a sudden your ear goes, oh, that low frequency pulse goes with that upper mid-range attack. Now I hear this thing working together, and now the bottom end sounds big and powerful and tight and audible to me. My ear is attracted to hearing what's going on in the low end in a coherent, intelligible sense. Doesn't just have to be there, though. There are other types of kick drums where it might be more like 1K or 2K that's being boosted instead of 2K to 6K. But it's that general idea to think about. Where in the mid-range should this kick drum be speaking? Maybe in modern styles of metal, it's a little bit higher up and a little clickier, whereas maybe in hip-hop, it's a little bit lower down and a little bit earthier sounding. But the same concept applies. Similar concept also applies to bass. On a lot of rock basses, the area that really gives the bass its definition and tone might be somewhere from 800 hertz to 1K, maybe even as high as 1.5K. There is this area right in the mid-range that gives the note definition and growl to an electric bass that makes it sound defined and interesting in the mix, and lets your ear hear what's happening in the low end better. It can be different in different styles. There might be some pop or R&B basses where the boost is higher in the upper mid-range, and maybe it's being boosted 2K, 3K, 4K, 5K, and that's what's giving the bass some kind of glossy shimmer or definition. It really depends on genre, but the same concept is still there. Finding the right area in the mid-range in which that instrument can speak. And this is one of the reasons that monitors like the classic Oratones that are over my shoulder, that's an original pair of 1970s Oratones, can be so useful for mixers, because they basically take away everything below 100 hertz and then say, can you hear your low end now? Because this is how most people are hearing your low end. If you can hear your kick and your bass on these, it's because you've got the mid-range of your kick and your bass right, which might, in some cases, be even more important than getting the low end on your kick and bass right. Because getting the mid-range on your kick and bass right, that is going to be what gives you the definition in your low-end instruments that makes the actual low frequencies there useful, audible, and intelligible. So when you want to boost lows, when you want to boost low-frequency instruments, ask yourself, why am I doing it? Is it because I need more low-frequency energy in this mix? I really do need more bottom end. I can hear my bottom end clearly, and I know it needs more of it. Or is it because you just want to hear your bass better, or your kick drum better, or your bass synth better? If it's because you want to hear those instruments better, it's often a good idea to look at boosts in the mid-range, not in the low frequencies, and sometimes not with overall level on the instrument. All right, with that idea number 2 out of the way of getting your mid-range right, we've got number 3 coming at you. Number 3, most important reason your low end sucks is because your monitoring sucks. And this is the situation for so many of us, especially newer mixers and newer producers, especially if you don't have treatment up in your room that's supposed to help you understand your low end. And even there are some fairly advanced mixers who've been at it for a while. They don't have superbly treated rooms. They don't have necessarily the best speakers in the world, but they're somehow able to make it work. And that's because there's more than one way to attack this problem of your monitoring sucking. Way number 1 is you get better speakers that can go lower in frequency. Maybe you add a sub that helps you hear low frequencies better. But that isn't good enough on its own, because if you're just pumping an untreated room full of extra low frequency, you're actually still not going to hear it well, because honestly, the more important ingredient in that equation is the room itself. If you don't have any acoustic treatment up on the walls and you're in like a square room, you can put the best speakers in the universe in that room. They're not going to tell you anything accurate about the low end, because the room itself has an even bigger influence on your low end than your speakers do. No question about it. I would absolutely rather have a $500 set of speakers in a well-treated room than a $5,000 set of speakers in a gymnasium. Does that help hammer the point home for you? The room is a way bigger impact than the speakers themselves. Get good speakers, yes, but think about the room situation. Starting with some acoustic treatment, usually I would recommend an inexpensive way to get something happening in your low end is getting 6-inch fiberglass insulated panels as broadband absorbers that you'll hang up in the corners of your room. And that can do a lot. It'll actually be effective below 100 hertz, and it can be a huge, inexpensive way to help without going too crazy. It's a great place to start at the very least. Another thing that you can do is get a software calibration system going, like SonarWorks, Sound ID Reference, that kind of thing. There's others who make similar solutions as well. But that idea of some speaker calibration EQ, if you're in a really not optimal room, can be a big help. The one problem with the EQ solution is it doesn't help with that issue of, okay, I'm sitting here and the bass sounds one way, I move 6 inches this way, the bass sounds totally different, I move 6 inches this way, the bass sounds totally different again. You really need to look at treating the room itself to help get rid of that problem to some degree, but at least in any one spot in the room, getting things calibrated with EQ correction can be really helpful, and there's really useful, easy systems for doing that these days. But another thing you can do, and this would have been sacrilege not too long ago, is that you can get really good headphones that give you really good information about the low frequencies. And I have found, unfortunately, that some of the most popular headphones for mixing that are really good in the mid-range and high frequencies, not to name you Sennheiser, but Sennheiser, some of their headphones, really great flat mid-range and high frequencies, but there's almost nothing going on below 100 hertz in those headphones, so it's hard to make decisions about low frequencies. Meanwhile, these blue Mixify headphones, they've also been sold as the Lola headphones. You can see I've had these so long that the covering is wearing off on them. They do not have exceptionally flat mid-range or high frequencies. They're a little dark in the mid-range and highs, which I don't mind, but they actually give me useful information about what's going on below 100 hertz in material I listen to on them. So literally every single master I've ever done, I've double-checked on these headphones. And because I've heard every single master I've ever done on these headphones and all of my clients' reference mixes on these headphones, when needed, if I'm on the road and I'm not near my lovely high-end mastering monitors that aren't actually in the shot, there are some Ex Machina monitors for anyone who's wondering. If I'm not here in front of my main mastering monitors, I can take these headphones on the road with a laptop and literally master a record using nothing but these headphones. And the results sound identical to what I get in the studio. It's just not as much fun doing it as doing that in nice high-end speakers. And I have to do a little bit more cross-referencing and checking, but I can absolutely make it work. Another one of the best mastering engineers who's out there today, a guy named Glenn Schick, I've interviewed him multiple times. He masters on nothing but headphones. He uses a very nice $4,000 pair of headphones, but the concept is the same. He knows and understands those headphones, and those headphones do give him useful low-frequency information. So that's the essential thing, that you know and trust your headphones and that they're giving you useful information about the lows. Which leads me to the last point about fixing this problem of your monitoring sucking. And that is that you can learn almost anything, almost any set of speakers, almost any room, almost any set of headphones, so long as you are willing to learn them. And how do you learn them? You listen to a lot of music through them. Great sounding records that you love the sound of. And you compare your results to your favorite sounding records on whatever system it is. Whether it's a $100 set of speakers in an untreated room, or whether it is a cheap set of headphones, whatever, you can learn them if you listen to high quality reference material through those things again and again and compare your own work to high quality reference material through those things again and again. Andrew Sheps is a name that comes up a lot. I believe I've been told he mixes practically exclusively on Sony MDR7506 headphones. If you ask me, they're some of the worst sounding headphones in the world. I hate them. To make them sound good, you have to make everything sound too harsh, too bright, too brash, too annoying. But guess what? He has been working on those headphones for so long. He knows them inside and out, and he knows what a good mix should sound like on those headphones. So he mixes predominantly on them, to my understanding. So if he can learn those, you can learn just about anything. But learning just about anything does take more work and has a longer learning curve than doing some decent treatment in your room. So my recommendation is to fight that battle on all fronts. You do the best you can with speaker and headphone selection. You do the best you can within reason on acoustically treating your room. You do the best you can within reason on EQ calibrating your room. And you do the best you can beyond reason in listening to a ton of great sounding records on your system again and again, and listening honestly to your own results next to what your favorite records sound like. For bonus points, while you're learning, you can also bring up frequency analyzers and look at what the bass looks like on a frequency analyzer on your favorite records in your style and your records. And if you're not happy with how your low end sounds when it gets out of the studio, chances are in the studio, it's going to look different too on those frequency analyzers. In mastering, I have frequency analyzers running all the time, and I don't master relying on them. But what I use them to do is I say to myself, ooh, something's a little off. Something's off in the low end here. I feel like there's too much sub or too little sub. Where exactly is it? Is it more like 80 hertz or more like 60 hertz? I don't know. But the frequency analyzer knows. So I ask the frequency analyzer and it tells me. You can use it that way too. Or just to say to myself, I think this one's a little subby. The best way for me to find that out is to listen to it against a bunch of other records. But if I was in a room where I didn't trust my low end, I would 100% look as well to check. Because I'd say, I don't really know what my room's telling me about 60 hertz and below. Does it look like there's too much 60 hertz on my record or not enough? Let me look at it compared to some of my favorite records. And that can give you some insights as well. All right, we've gotten super deep into low end, which is one of my favorite topics, but I hope this one's useful for you because I think if you get this part of your mixing together, so much of the rest of your mixing is going to come together so much more easily. The low end is like the foundation of your mix. And if you get it right, the other pieces can fall into place as well. I hope these have been useful for you. Let me know which of these three issues has plagued you the most. Do you feel like you have personally conquered any of these three issues? If you have, let me know. I want to hear about it in the comments down below. Or feel free to email me. You can always hit me at podcast@sonicscoop.com. Either way, I read every single one that comes in and I respond when I can. But if you got this far with me, then you know what that means? It means you're totally weird and that I totally like you. And that if you want to learn more about mixing and handling your low end or mastering or compression, who better to do it with? We've got some great full-length courses for you to check out, like Mixing Breakthroughs, which will give you a system to everything in the mix, not just your low frequencies, to make your creativity and confidence go way up and your finishing rate go way up, while your second guessing of yourself and your time to complete each mix goes way down. Is all of that possible at once in one course? Yes, and we've got the testimonials to prove it, but you can prove it to yourself. Try it out. There's no risk to you because it comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Check it out over at mixingbreakthroughs.com. If you prefer to learn everything that I know about mastering, you can check out my full-length course on mastering over at masteringendemystified.com. Also a money-back guarantee on that one. Or if you really want to get a handle on compression, learn how to hear it, understand it, and use it like a pro, then Compression Breakthroughs is the course for you. It's one of the most useful things I've ever put together. We have in-depth compression masterclasses for every single instrument, in every single genre. Check it out over at compressionbreakthroughs.com. Last quick shout out to our sponsors, Soundtoys, making some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days at soundtoys.com. And last, certainly not least, if you want something free for yourself, check out GPU Audio, where you can right now get limited time early access to the open beta for their awesome sounding convolution reverb that runs on the GPU in your computer. And very soon there's going to be a whole suite of free plugins that run on the GPU of your computer over there at gpu.audio/sonicscoop. That's gpu.audio/sonicscoop. So go check them out. Thanks for hanging out with me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. See you next time.